Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. Russia's war-fueled economy is running out of steam. Growth has slowed to near zero. Inflation is high, and even Putin's closest allies warn of technical stagnation. Moscow is turning to China for lifelines, like the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. But Beijing's support comes at a price. Let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Russia's economy has slipped into what even loyal insiders call technical stagnation. At the Vladivostok Forum, Sberbank chief German Grief warned growth was approaching zero, crushed by high interest rates and endless military spending. Forecasts slash next year's growth to barely 1.5%, while the budget deficit already blew past its annual target. 5 trillion rubles gone by July. Oil and gas revenues, once Moscow's safety net, are failing fast under drone strikes, weak prices and a stronger ruble. And yet, Vladimir Putin has brushed the warnings aside. On stage in Vladivostok, he insisted Russia's long-standing economic model would weather the storm.
We have always proceeded from the point of view that stable macroeconomics is the cornerstone for developing the country's economy and social policy. That's been the case for at least 15 years. This approach has come to yield positive results, creating conditions for progress in the country. I'm sure it will continue to work.
But the numbers suggest a different reality. China now keeps Moscow afloat. Bilateral trade hit €246 billion last year, and Chinese microchips, engines and optics keep surfacing in Russian drones over Ukraine. This week, Gazprom and CNPC also signed a binding deal to build the long-delayed Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, a project meant to redirect Russian gas from Europe to China via Mongolia. Nearly 100 Chinese companies are supplying sanctioned goods to Russia's factories. In just 6 months of 2024, more than 2,000 Harpy drones rolled off the production line, almost the entire output of the previous year. Stagnation in the economy, expansion on the battlefield. With Beijing's lifeline and Putin's defiance, Moscow bets it still can move forward, whatever the cost.
And now let's zone in on the East-splaining portion of our show. Every September since 2015, Russia has hosted the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok. President Vladimir Putin launched it to showcase opportunities in Russia's Far East. But the event is more than economics. It's a stage for Moscow's shifting foreign policy.
The forum was established by presidential decree to develop Russia's remote Far East. This region, rich in oil, gas and minerals, is strategically located next to China, North Korea and Japan. Vladivostok, once close to foreigners as a military city, became a symbolic gateway to Asia. From the beginning, the Kremlin invited leaders from across Asia to highlight Russia's Pacific ambitions. Japan, South Korea and India were frequent participants. But in recent years, China has overshadowed all others, with Beijing sending the largest delegations and striking the most visible deals. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the sanctions that followed, the forum gained new urgency. With Europe closed off, Moscow began to present Vladivostok as a hub for developing new markets in Asia, especially in energy, logistics and technology. But economics is only part of the story. Each year, Putin uses his keynote speech to denounce the West and argue for a multipolar world order. The event is designed to show that Russia is not isolated but is actively building partnerships in the East. Today, the Kremlin's goals are clear: deepen investment ties with China and India, secure long-term energy contracts, and project the image of international engagement. For Putin, the Eastern Economic Forum is less about the deals signed on the stage and more about proving that Russia still has options.
And now we're zooming in on Moscow and its economy to explore the issue in greater detail. Russia's wartime economy has hit a wall. At the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok, Sberbank chief German Grief warned that the second quarter of 2025 showed technical stagnation, with July and August GDP growth close to zero. This is despite record defense spending, which has kept headline growth afloat until now. Grief urged Russia's central bank to slash its key interest rate from 18 to 12%, saying only then would there be, and I quote, hope for recovery. But inflation is still 8.8%, and many doubt such cuts will even work. Experts are blunt. The Russian economy is not only stagnating, it is declining. The fundamentals look grim. GDP grew over 4% in 2023 and 2024, driven by war spending. But the IMF now expects just 0.9% growth in 2025, the steepest downgrade among major economies. Russian finance minister told Putin growth may sink as low as 1.5%, far below earlier forecasts. Factories are underutilized, some shifting to 4-day work weeks, while consumer demand weakens. A June poll showed 58% of Russians now see rising prices as their top concern, compared with only 33% naming the war. Now, amid this slowdown, Russia is leaning harder on China. On the 2nd of September, Gazprom and China's CNPC signed a binding memorandum on the long-delayed Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. The project, estimated to cost between 13 and 34 billion US dollars, would send 50 billion cubic meters of gas per year from Western Siberia to China through Mongolia, supplementing the 38 billion cubic meters already flowing through the first pipeline. That is far less than the 157 billion cubic meters Russia once sold to Europe, but still billions in revenue Moscow so desperately needs. For Beijing, it's cheap long-term energy and a hedge against supply shocks. For Moscow, it is proof that without China, its war economy may actually not be able to hold. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Krzysztof Piech, Professor of Economics at the Lazarski University. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thank you for inviting me again.
So, the Power of Siberia 2, insofar as sequels go, do you think this is going to be good enough to actually save the Russian economy?
The Russian economy is under pressure from different angles. We mean sanctions, of course, but also very recently, also the Ukraine strikes on military infrastructure, on oil and gas industry. So any economic measures will be difficult to help the economy unless the war stops.
So the Power of Siberia itself is not intended to actually address all these issues at once. But can it even provide Russia with the sort of offset from the losses that it incurred as a result of basically losing all the contracts on the European market?
Although Russia has lost a lot of contracts in Europe, but it was able to rebuild and deepen, develop its contacts with China, with Iran, with India, and these are very large markets. So despite the sanctions, the Russian economy was able to survive and even develop in some areas, although the oil prices, which Russia exports, had to be lower because of the sanctions that were imposed by the Western allies.
So, looking at the situation from a broader perspective, because we do have a certain amount of indications from Russia itself, and they're unusually clear about there being problems, right? We have the chief of the central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, who said that essentially Russia had reached the edge of capacity. What do you make of that? I mean, normally in an authoritarian system, you don't really get such negative signals insofar as the government and its inner workings are concerned, right?
In response, Putin has started criticizing her, what didn't happen from the very beginnings of the war. So maybe there are also some political tensions over the situation of the governor of the central bank who might be replaced maybe in the future, because the interest rates are very, very high compared to the inflation. Interest rates are 18%, while inflation is about 9%. In other countries, in Western countries, countries that situation is unimaginable. But in Russia, it continues. So there is a lot of space to decrease the interest rates, and thanks to that, help the economy growing. But the problem is with a very restrictive monetary policy. So that may cause Putin to put some more pressure on the central bank, even with replacing the governor of the bank.
Can he actually afford to do that, though? I mean, technocrats seem to be operating on a sort of different level in Russia, right? I mean, you need to be competent in your specific field when it comes to the economy. You simply cannot place cronies or, people from the government in a circle and expect them to manage the economy in a professional manner. So can Putin actually afford to go to war with the central bank?
Yes, it's possible, because at the moment, if Putin has to choose the priority, what is the most important thing for him, is to win the war or to have the healthy economy. I think the war is more important to him, not to other technocrats, of course, not to oligarchs who want to make business and money, but for Putin, war seems to be the highest priority, and I think he could in order to win the war, he could sacrifice the economy together with the head of the central bank's governor.
Aren't the two things too interconnected, though? I mean, in order to win a war, you need to have a functioning economy. Now, we actually are coming to the very essence of the problem. Can the economy survive such abuse and the continuing, shifting of priorities to the war long enough for the war to actually end in a way the Kremlin wants to? Or is the economy going to essentially find itself in very serious trouble before that?
This war lasts for almost 3 years already, so it's a long time to change the priorities. Usually, when we speak about countries in war, they have problems with inflation, with budgetary deficits, and so on. So far, the economic situation in Russia was more or less healthy. What wasn't the intention, of course, of the Western allies who wanted to impose sanctions and force the Putin to change his military actions because of the economy. It didn't work. So at the moment, I think that may cause also the shifts in Russian politics in order to speed up maybe freezing the economic, the military activities in Ukraine, making the good ground for further peace talks. I think he can sacrifice the economy. Maybe later, after the war stops, he can rebuild the economy, but usually during wars, economy is not more so important. Inflation usually goes up, even to sometimes hyperinflation, what we have seen in some countries, including Germany after the First World War, or even Poland.
So what do you make of the rather alarmist statements that were made by Sberbank's CEO, Mr. German Gref? He essentially said that the economy is heading towards a decline, or at least towards stagnation. Does Putin not worry that this could put a dent in his war plans?
It is a signal that the economy is finally suffering because of the war. But let's look at the indicators. The Ministry for Economy and the Central Bank has cut the forecast of economic growth in Russia this year to 1.5%. IMF has estimated that the growth will be slightly lower, 0.9%, what means that there is still some growth of Russian economy. And Russia didn't have a recession, actually. If we can imagine the country that runs such a fully scaled war without a recession, that's quite enormous. So if the recession is for 2 years and GDP declines by 5%, that would be a kind of if I may say so, normal situation during the war if the country runs it. It wasn't the case because of the military industry, because of the expenditures on military industry and so on. So still, there is some space to have a recession, longer and deeper recession that Russia didn't have so far, and it won't force Russia to stop the war. So economic situation is not the major, let's say, cause of political decisions whether to stop the war or maybe not.
So that's the fundamental question, because we know from recent polls that most Russians are more afraid about economic hardship than about the fact that their country is at war. They mostly really kind of like don't really care whether the war is still on or not. But if they were faced with economic problems, well, they would actually notice. So this is a question many leaders in the West are asking themselves what to do in order to put real pressure on the Russian economy.
Exactly, and I was wondering about that for a couple of weeks or even months, like the other economists and analytics. So I think if the Western countries could help Ukraine to build its military sector, especially in the areas of drones and missiles, especially long-range missiles, that could help Ukraine with destroying Russian infrastructure, oil and gas infrastructure, and that could stop the cars of common citizens if they can't buy fuel at the petrol station. Finally, they will suffer the economic consequences of a war at Ukraine. And I think that would be the most powerful measure that could help Ukraine with fighting with the war, to stimulate the technological development of Ukraine towards building long-range missiles that could hit Russian economy, especially the oil and gas infrastructure.
So it's already happening, and they are down by how much exactly? Was it 15%? 18%, there were very different figures being bandied about. But yes, this is quite substantial. The capacity, yes, the capacity is down.
Even
how much would it need to go down?
Recent estimates were about 21%, but it's still not enough. 50%, that could be very harmful, because that could show that the impact of war is very serious. So 20% is still not enough. 50% could be very.
Is it achievable? Do you think it's achievable at this stage, given that most of the refining capacity is the European part of Russia? So with the new types of missiles with a 3,000-kilometer range, all these facilities could be reached by the Ukrainian forces, right?
Yes, and the refineries is one thing. Of course, they can be moved further to some Siberia to avoid the range of the long-range missiles, but also the infrastructure matters. The pipelines delivering fuel and gas to Moscow, and so if that's destroyed, then finally common citizens, Russians, will put some pressure on Putin to finally first freeze the war activities and then to sign the peace treaty.
But it's still pressure on common citizens, not in the military, right? Because the military uses diesel, so they don't need that refining capacity. Does Ukraine have the ability to disrupt the supply of diesel fuel as well in any meaningful way?
At the moment, not so much, because the sources of oil and gas is quite far from the range of Ukraine missiles. But with the help of Western allies, without even exporting missiles to long-range missiles to Ukraine, because that was something that was discussed for months. What kind of missiles should Ukraine receive from Western countries? But helping Ukraine to build its own military industry, that could be, let's say, Ukrainians would know what to do best with their capacities, but we Westerners should help them with rebuilding, with developing the industry.
Professor Krzysztof Piech was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. More than 24 countries have pledged military support for Ukraine once the war comes to an end. The plan marks a scheme for the largest multinational deployment in Europe since NATO's Kosovo mission.
A 26-nation coalition has agreed to deploy troops or military equipment to Ukraine after a future peace agreement with Russia. The group, which includes France, the UK, Germany, Japan and Canada, will provide logistical, training and air defense support, but not frontline combat forces. The agreement is part of wider Western security guarantees aimed at deterring future Russian aggression. US President Donald Trump, who hosted a security summit in Washington earlier this week, emphasized that European allies will take the lead, with the US providing intelligence and surveillance. The mission is set to be coordinated by NATO structures, though not formally under the alliance's flag, a move aimed at avoiding direct confrontation with Moscow.
Sweden has accused Russia of widespread GPS interference over the Baltic Sea. The jamming has disrupted civilian flights across the region.
Swedish defense officials say Russia is conducting deliberate and dangerous GPS jamming operations that are affecting aircraft over the Baltic. Pilots flying near the Swedish coast have reported navigation failures, with many forced to switch to manual positioning or delay landings. The disruption appears to originate from Russia's Kaliningrad enclave and parts of Belarus. Sweden has filed a formal complaint with Moscow, warning the activity endangers civilian lives and violates international aviation norms. The jamming is also impacting neighboring Finland and Latvia, according to Eurocontrol data. While Russia has denied involvement, Swedish officials say the pattern mirrors similar interference during recent NATO exercises.
Authorities in Russia's Far East are tightening rules around alcohol sales. Officials blame rising crime and population decline on alcohol abuse.
At least 5 Russian regions, including Khabarovsk and Amur, have announced stricter limits on alcohol sales, capping purchase hours and banning night sales entirely. Some districts are also restricting sales near schools, military facilities and construction sites. Local officials say the goal is to reduce domestic violence and workplace injuries, especially in regions struggling with labor shortages. But critics argue the move is politically motivated, aimed at cracking down on social unrest amid economic decline. Russia has a long history of using alcohol policy as a tool of state control. According to World Health Organization data, the country still ranks among the world's top alcohol-consuming nations, despite previous efforts to curb excessive drinking.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.